In preparation, I took a look at the issue of the hotels that was put out a few years ago, and it told me that you arrived on January the 1st, 1955. Where did you come from, and why did you come to Chalk River?
Well, I came from Montreal. I had been working at the Sun Life in Montreal for over 3 years, and it was a very dull job. And I was sharing an apartment with a girl whose boss told me that he had been here, and why didn't I apply here? So I did that.
Aha, very good. Now, it also said in the write-up that you came as a computer. And that's an interesting term because it was on the old calculating machines. I spoke to you a few years ago and you mentioned that there were actually 3 different versions of we have one of the machines here now. What were the different types of machines that were being used at that time?
Well, they were all similar. The one I had on my desk was a Marchand, but there was also I've forgotten its name now.
Yeah, that's no problem. How big a group was there?
Well, I came to theoretical physics branch, and there were 3 of us doing this job. At that time, I came to replace Pam Dyson-Attry, who had been sent down to Toronto to work on Ferret at the University of Toronto. And that, I understand, was the 2nd commercial machine ever sold, this Ferranti machine called Ferret. And Pam was still a Chalk River employee,
right,
but she was sent to work on Ferret.
Uh-huh. On these mechanical machines, when I try to use even my electronic calculator and I'm adding up a big column, I find I make mistakes very easily. So when you were doing some of these big calculations, did you have to repeat them several times to check yourself, or did it get farmed out to 2 people to check each other off, or?
No, we never checked each other's work, but we were all very careful, and I don't remember the precautions we took. But the professional people were kind enough to include us as authors on their papers, so
right,
we were responsible.
Good. And that was theoretical physics with Hank Clayton as the...
Hank Clayton was the branch head.
Right.
And there were 7 others that I can remember at that time. So there were 8 professionals of theoretical physics and 3 of us who were doing the calculations and 1 secretary.
Uh-huh. And were you doing just the calculations for the theoretical physics group, or were there other groups who were sending in calculations that needed to be done?
No, not direct calculations, but the theoretical people
right,
would be working with other people all around and about.
Sure. Were there other groups within the plant, other groups of calculators at that time too, that you know of?
I don't believe so.
Aha, okay. 2 years later after you got here, the Datatron arrived.
Right.
So all of a sudden you didn't have to do this punching into those machines, you had to retrain and become really a programmer?
Programmer.
How did you enter the data into the Datatron early on? Did it come with the paper tape reader, or did you have to flip switches just, or?
No switches that I know of. We had Hollerith cards. No paper tape.
Right.
No paper tape for programs.
Right.
As far as I remember, there would sometimes be paper tape that was output from experiments.
Right.
If we were doing a job for somebody round and about.
Right.
But I believe it was only the Hollerith cards.
Now, I don't know that I've seen a Hollerith card. What was it like compared to the later punch cards?
Well, I think that They were all the same. That's
Okay.
what they were called.
Okay.
They were about 3 or 4 inches high and 8 inches long, maybe.
Okay,
with the
so
corner cut off usually.
right. Okay, so they predated the real good use of paper tape. That I hadn't realized that. The Datatron we know was tube based, so there were all kind of modules into there that must have gone wrong every once in a while. Was there a problem of halfway through calculations, people had to switch around and see which unit was missing? Or
I wasn't aware
Okay.
of that. I think maintenance would have been done now and again. When we got later machines, there were 2 or 3 people on staff who were not employed by us. They were employed by the supplier of the computer.
Right.
And they were in charge of maintenance.
Okay. And then not too long after that, 4 or 5 years later, the CDC arrived.
Well, the Datatron was Burroughs' company.
Right.
And then the G20 came, and it was Bendix.
Okay.
And Bendix got eaten up by Control Data Corporation.
Okay.
And so after that, we had the CDC 3300 and 6600, and then eventually the 7600.
Right, okay. And the Datatron, clearly, we received from you some time ago all the manuals, so that was a great contribution to the society. The 66 system arrived, and did they begin to change the input and output, how people had to deal with that?
Well, the next was the G20, and it was still the card system. Yeah, someone would punch the cards. The programs were put on the cards.
Right.
Same as for the Datatron.
Right.
And there were programs and data, and it was all read in on a
Right.
card reader. And the output, this is to the G20.
Right.
Yeah.
When did the computing center as such come into being? Was that with the bigger machines, or?
No, it was, well, it depends on how you look at it. As soon as the Datatron was coming, there was a building built for it.
The 508?
The 508,
Right.
yeah, because before that we were in theoretical physics building, that little wooden building was next door to 508. So we all moved over to 508, and with the arrival of the Datatron. Something interesting we did for the Datatron was that it was programmed in programming language. So we wrote an assembler, so-called assembler, for the Datatron. And so that made it a little easier. Well, I mean, you knew what to do, but it was interesting that
Right.
we did that here. Jim Kennedy was the head of the computing center, and that's how things were organized that you were asking about, was that we were still part of theoretical physics branch, so our branch head was still Hank Clayton, but Jim Kennedy was head of the computing center in
Okay.
building 508.
I remember having to have data that was in huge boxes of the cards, just
Yeah.
oodles of them. And the fear was always that you would drop them, you would lose them, and it would all get mixed up. So we ended up also with satellite places around the site. For instance, in Building 145, there was a center where we could just take our box of cards and bring them over, and they would read them, and then later on the trucks would come around with all the big outputs.
Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't part of that, so I really didn't know too much what was going on. There were operators for the machines. I think I don't remember about the G20. we probably read in our own cards for that.
Right.
But with the G20, there were operators.
Right. And the other thing that all of a sudden began to appear were the big reels of magnetic tape, so that people could store their data and repeat it once more and read it off. Did that come in sort of in the G20 era, or was it later?
I think it was G20, because I can picture it with all these cabinets with the big rolls of magnetic tape.
Were there also ongoing changes into the languages that you had to program and to learn, and when you went from the Datatron to the G20 to the...
Well, I was telling you we did an assembler for the Datatron, and it was interesting because the hardware, the machine itself was designed to use binary coded decimal, it was called.
Okay, yeah.
And so it was basically binary, of course, but the figures 0 to 9 were coded in binary, and that was the basic unit of the machine. So you would code in numbers, and that was the Datatron. So when you got to the G20, it was bits and bytes, which are, I mean, bytes are only a group of 8 bits.
Right.
So it came, I can't remember for sure. Well, I do think I remember. It came with a version of Fortran and a version of the European system called Alcom, which was coded for the G20. So what we did with that was we wrote our own algebraic compiler, which we called Apex. The assembler for the Datatron we called ACE, so we had Apex for the G20, and everybody loved that. It was more sophisticated than Fortran, although Fortran in the end became the standard. But it was fun to do, and everybody loved having it, because with that you could just put your algebra, essentially put your algebra in, and in terms that the experimenter understood.
Right. And
our compiler took that and turned it into machine language for the G20.
Yeah. In addition to the manuals you donated to us was also 3 of those colossal discs.
Oh yeah.
They were amazing things. I would imagine when they started up or anything, it was a big roar as they got up to 1800 RPM and reading out of them. Were they a pleasant thing for the computing people, or were they a headache often?
Well, I had nothing to do with that. They were just part of the...
They were part of the hardware.
Equipment, yeah.
That's right, okay. We continue on to where we went from calculating machines, we went to the big mainframes, and all of a sudden in about the late 80s and early 90s, PCs, personal computers, began to come in. And the mainframes sort of began to disappear. The computing center also became more of a storage facility, or?
Well, I'm not sure what happens now. I think the storage is like the cloud is now. It's somewhere elsewhere.
Right.
But that's getting to the time of the PCs is about the time I retired.
Well,
So I didn't really know much about that. We had terminals round and about the plant
Right.
before the PCs. And so it was sort of an intermediate stage.
right.
Yeah.
I know by
So people had to do more of their own,
yes.
which was perhaps just a change of philosophy, because before that the computing center was there to help the experimenters who were doing their thing, and they didn't have to know about programming and all
right.
that. So
It also, the PCs took over a little bit from the secretaries as well, because I remember people setting up their own conference papers on it the way that they'd wanted to. So there were certainly changes being brought in. So actually you did the transition all the way from a byte to megabytes to now gigabytes that are used all over. You retired in 1988, okay? And have enjoyed a lot of things. And my wife would feel unhappy if I didn't ask you about your knitting. Did that come as a result of your sort of knowing programming and it just flipped over? Or
nothing to do with
nothing
each
to do
other.
with that?
No.
For anyone else who is listening in, Arden did a fantastic exhibit in the library several years ago of many, many years of very, very complicated patterns in knitting. You're highly regarded as the most proficient and best knitter into Deep River.
Well, I certainly have a lot of experience.
Good.
And lucky to have had lots of good things to do in that area. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming and giving us a bit of the history of what the computing started from early machines like the Marchand and working through the various systems and increasing the knowledge that we have of what happened into those days.
Yes, well, it's a long time ago now. You know, I've been retired as long as I worked at Chalk River.
Aha.
So that's a lot of time. The other thing I was going to say, that sometimes I mention to people about if they say, oh, you're such a good knitter or whatever, I say, well, you know, it's just exactly the same as computing, because for computing, all the technical stuff we have today is based on zeros and ones, just the same as knitting is based on knit and purl.
Right, okay, very good, yes.